the junior senator from the state of Utah, who's actually not so much a junior anymore. At 3 years, you've certainly made a name for yourself, and some of it good, and some of it, has probably been a little bit of a challenge for you. But I don't see any black eyes, so I guess you're doing all right. That's right. The hairline's receding, but I'm otherwise intact. I would like to talk about some specific land issues, and we've got to start on this. And, RS 2477, which you've been a big champion of, has kind of moved to the back with public lands transfer, but we're starting to see some of these restrictive policies come back around. Recently, the Richfield RMP, the Resource Management Plan, has to be re-looked at after they spent 8 years figuring out what they were going to do for the next 20. We get into it like 4 years, and they say, well, you know what? We just didn't look at enough stuff, and we have to reanalyze that. And they promised that this was the beginning of an iceberg, or the tip of an iceberg, and things were going to continue to happen. What are your thoughts on this rework of the RMP?
The whole idea of a resource management plan is to put in place a set of expectations that people can have, especially at the local level, about how land within the region can be used. And so after you spend the better part of a decade carefully analyzing and scrutinizing every possible outcome, and then you go back after the fact and say, never mind, that wasn't good, you undermine the whole process. You undermine FLPMA and the system that it's set in place to guarantee that we would have access to our federal public lands for multiple use. So I think this is a real step backward. I think this is a real unfortunate occurrence, and I think it's something that will ultimately hurt the hardworking men and women of the lands affected within that. I think it's a shame, and it illustrates the larger problem of having this much land owned by any one institution, especially the federal government.
Well, the counties involved in this feel that they were legitimate stakeholders according to FLPMA, and that the industries that use those public lands were legitimate stakeholders. The environmental community was also one of those stakeholders, but then they've come back around and triggered this whole thing by threatening litigation. Is there something wrong with that system?
Well, yeah, I think there is. And first of all, you're right. Under FLPMA, the entities that you mentioned are legitimate stakeholders. But apparently some are more legitimate than others. If one group of those stakeholders can go around and wage a collateral attack on the outcome after it's already been supposedly set in stone. So I think that's a problem, and I think it does not bode well for future negotiations in connection with future RMPs. And I think it also bodes ill for those who would otherwise be inclined to invest in our state, to invest in the people here and in the resources available to us here as Utahns. They're going to be more reluctant to invest in that in the future, knowing that even after a decision's made, it may not be final, and in fact, it probably won't.
Well, along those same lines, we're in a boil right now because of the November 19th BLM lease. It was 144,000 acres that was put on it was scheduled to be on the auction block based on requests of exploration people. At the last minute, they withheld 100,000 acres. They didn't even communicate with the counties about it and put 44,000 up. The BLM says that they were worried about cultural concerns that had come up, things involving the old Spanish Trail. Is this not a good faith effort as far as the BLM is concerned, in your opinion?
First of all, we have to keep in mind that it's not just a few companies that are hurt by this. Those oil companies or anyone else who might be investing, they're just one piece of the bigger picture. The bigger picture that I'm most worried about includes those hardworking Utahns who would otherwise have had access to good jobs, who would otherwise have had access to the revenue and the great things that could be done with that revenue as it came into these local communities, many of which are really suffering, and in many cases suffering as a result of bad federal land management policies already in place prior to this decision. This decision demonstrates that this administration, like other administrations before this one, is not in a good position to be able to claim that they are superior managers of our lands in Utah.
Yeah, but you're hurting the environment as well, and that's what most of these decisions are, is to protect the environment.
And my response to that is absolute nonsense. Look, the best environmentalists are the people who live closest to the land. Ranchers, hunters, recreation enthusiasts, those are true environmentalists. Those are the people who actually live close to this land. They don't want the land to be dirtied. They don't want the air to be polluted. They want to protect it, and they want to protect it in a way that also preserves their interests. Those are the people who ought to be making decisions about how best to protect the land, not government bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
Well, that would kind of tie into the issue of sage grouse, because the state put forward a plan that at one point the U.S. Fish and Wildlife said, hey, this is a good plan. This is how things should look. And they took into mitigation effects wildfires. They took in grazing, and they thought, well, we need to be better managers of grazing because grazing actually improves the habitat for the sage grouse. And as we now move forward, we find that they've kind of backtracked on that grazing. It looks like there's an attempt to push grazing off of public lands, and the ranchers are saying that will lead to more catastrophic wildfires.
That's right. And this is yet another demonstration of the fact that a lot of these decisions are based far more on political considerations and key constituencies that are good for the liberal fundraising base than they are on sound science. If we were to base these decisions on sound science, then we would end up with a habitat preservation plan that would look much more similar to what has been proposed quite reasonably by people in the state of Utah. And that's what we need to remain focused on, is the fact that the people who are best equipped to preserve the environment and to protect species like the sage grouse are the people right here in the state of Utah.
Did we learn any lessons from the government shutdown and the fact that the state ponied up and said, you know what, we'll pay if you'll open up those parks? Was there a lesson learned there?
Absolutely, without question. Look, when we saw that happen, we saw that people at the state and the local level have the greatest stake in those lands and in keeping them open and in keeping them accessible to the American people. And we should therefore be more inclined to trust state and local officials with the management of those lands, for the most part, than we are federal officials. When we politicize federal land management policy, and when we have this much federal land under federal ownership, we're talking about roughly 1/3 of the land in the United States and 2/3 of the land in the state of Utah, bad things happen. When we play politics with the American people, hardworking men and women, middle-income earners and lower-income earners get hurt the most. And that's what I'm most worried about. And that's why this government shutdown only serves to underscore the fact that we should be less inclined to trust the management of 2/3 of our state to people who have no connection with our state whatsoever.
Do you think that we've demonstrated that we can actually run lands better? I mean, did the government shutdown show that we were able to do that as a state?
I think it did. It gave us an opportunity where we had state and local officials stepping forward saying, look, we're happy to manage this. I wish we had had an opportunity to actually do it. Unfortunately, the federal government sort of swooped in and took that over. But regardless, it showed that we have a strong interest in doing that. It also showed the real dangers of putting this much land ownership in the hands of the few, in the hands of the federal government, because it can be used quite easily as a political football, as a political weapon, one that is particularly potent in states like ours, where most of the land is owned by the federal government, and that's wrong.
Well, we'll continue our conversation with Senator Mike Lee after a commercial break, and we've got